Hello, everyone. Welcome to an all new episode of the Indic Underground. This is a show where we look at Indic culture and its interplay with modernity, and we talk to new emerging voices in the Indic cultural space. And the guest of today's show is Jeysundhar. Welcome to the show, Jay.
Hi, Vinay. Thank you.
Jay is an officer of the Indian Foreign Service. He works he's posted to Belarus and he's doing a yeoman service as far as helping evacuate Indians who are there, in that part of the region because there's been a conflict going on in the vicinity. So a lot of people got stranded there. So he's doing a great job.
Part of a larger team effort.
Yeah, absolutely. But the reason why we have Jay on today's show, I want to lay the ground context for this discussion. There was an article that came in the print titled India's Hindu Preachers How Shaiva Monks Converted Cambodia. It's an article written on the 25th of August by an author called Anirudh Kanisethi. So we will dissect the article, but for certain ground rules for this discussion, uh, we will be dissecting that article point by point in terms of sources. What is mentioned in the article? What are the other sources that address the same topic? And anywhere where we have an opinion, Jay, we will try and mention that specifically because the idea here is both of us are history buffs, right? We spoke about it
Absolutely.
offline as well, and for us, the truth and facts coming out is more important than anything else. So there is really no agenda beyond the truth. So we want to talk about fact based, source based, this point of view on what is mentioned there and what Jai has to, what sources Jai has referred to. And in places where, you're giving an opinion, we are discussing, we will mention that explicitly. We want at the end of this discussion an honest debate to take place and the audiences to make up their mind, as to what they actually want to believe in after analyzing both sides of the facts, right?
Absolutely.
The subline goes contrary to what we may think. Cambodia became Shaivite through active conversion by Hindu monks,
Mm-hmm.
market forces, and selective engaging with Indian ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So that is the crux of the hypothesis,
Mm-hmm.
right? In the first paragraph, he mentions for nearly 1,000 years, much of Southeast Asia followed religions that we think of as exclusively or originally Indian.
Hmm.
The colossal temple of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, beautifully described by William Dalrymple in a recent article in Financial Times. And the overgrown ruins, with their sense of depictions, with their serene depictions of Hindu deities, are often held up as proof that India colonized, inspired, or influenced Southeast Asia in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Your take on this?
Okay. The article has a very interesting premise in its claim that Cambodia became Shaivite through active conversion by Hindu monks, market forces, and selectively, which I think is a typo that says selectivity in the page, engaging with Indian ideas. Now, as a reader and as a history buff, as you said, I would have been very eager to understand what substantiation is provided for this claim. Sadly, though, there is very little to, I mean, when I'm saying very little, I'm being very charitable and generous to the author in saying that there's very little substantiation that the article itself provides to buttress this claim. So, coming to the first paragraph, for nearly 1,000 years, much of Southeast Asia followed religions that we think of as exclusively or originally Indian. The first paragraph is largely fine. It is relatively potboiler stuff that doesn't really attract any attention. It is an introduction, so to speak. But from there, it goes steadily downhill. So it goes on to say that starting from the 8th century CE all the way up to the 15th, the religious culture of Cambodia was predominantly Shaivite. This we have confirmed from other sources as well. So this we shall elaborate upon a little later when we talk about the overall presence of Shaivism in Southeast Asia. I'll just touch upon the fact that there are travelers such as Nagasena, the Indian Buddhist monk, who mentions that the dominant religion was the worship of Maheshwara. And we have other accounts as well that say that the dominant religion of the region was Shaivism. From there, the next claim that the author makes is that the process by which it became Shaivite is astonishing. And he says that this was due to active conversion by Hindu preachers and market forces emerging from Cambodian courts, or Indians emigrating in search of greener pastures. Now, the problem is we don't have any primary source substantiation for any of this, be it Hindu preachers or active conversion, or for that matter, market forces emerging from Cambodian courts. We don't have any proof for any of these claims. These are just tall claims made in thin air. More importantly, these are claims that are made by looking at the past through the prism of the present and superimposing vocabulary that is not essentially Indic onto concepts and theologies that are essentially Indic. And then the author goes into supposedly the specifics where he talks about Pasupata missionaries in India and abroad. To be honest, if he had given something at all to substantiate this claim of Pashupata missionaries, the article would have held some merit. However, if you go through the rest of the article where he talks about the emergence of Pashupatism as a sect within Shaivism, which is largely fine. But then the first source that he provides is a Deccan inscription from 660 CE. And he says this offers some insight into this process, where he talks about a ceremony that is conducted for the Chalukya king Vikramaditya I to initiate him into Shaivism by the Pashupata Guru Sudarshana Acharya. Now, the problem with
Okay.
this.
Jay, just one sec. I think the first point he talks about is Lakulisha.
Yeah, the Lakulisa point is largely fine. I can elaborate. I will elaborate upon it later in the talk where I talk
Okay,
about.
okay.
Okay, so as far as the point about Pashupata missionaries in India and abroad, the author mentions that roughly around the second century CE, legend holds that the corpse of a young man in Karohana or present day Karwa, Gujarat, was reanimated. This man, Lakulisa, then went about preaching a Shaiva doctrine revolving around asceticism and meditative practice to inculcate magical powers, and thus the sect known as Pashupatas was born. Now there are a couple of problems with this particular claim that is being made here. Now, as far as Lakulisa himself is concerned, we have references from more than one Purana. I will quote with chapter and verse because I prefer providing citations and sources that way, and not just making claims out of random thin air premises. In the Vayu Purana, in chapter 23, in the verses 209 to 214, and then in the Linga Purana, chapter 24, verses 124 to 133. Now let's start with the Linga Purana. The Linga Purana part, these verses come to us as a conversation between Shiva and Brahma. This entire chapter, Shiva tells Brahma what kind of incarnations or how he would be born in the earth in each cycle of the yugas. So, this Lakulisa part comes in the 28th cycle of the yugas. So this starts with the verse 124. If you were to go to the previous verse, it would be the 27th cycle of the Yugas and so on. So this narrative ends with the 28th cycle of the Yugas, which is the current one in which we are living. So Shiva says in the 28th cycle of the Yugas, when the Vyasa of that Yuga, this is how Shiva goes about it. In every Yuga, he gives the name of the Vyasa of that Yuga because Vyasa is the one who compiles the Vedas. And the Vyasa of that Yuga will be Krishna Dvaipayana, which is why we have this thing that Vyasa was also known as Krishna Dvaipayana. Shiva gives, when he talks about each Yuga, Shiva gives the name of what Vyasa would be in that particular Yuga. And Shiva says when Krishna Dvaipayana is Vyasa, he, as in Shiva, will enter a dead body and bring it to life. And this is supposed to happen in a place, as the author has claimed, this is not Karohana. The Purana is very clear. It says that the name of the place will be Kaya Varohana. Why is this important? Because the name itself tells you what that place is going to be important for. Because Kaya is body, Avarohana is descent. Shiva says he will descend into the body, into a dead body. He will avarohana into the kaya, and thereby this reanimated body, so to speak, will be called Lakulisa. Now, the name Lakulisa comes from the word Lakula, which means a rod, which is why all depictions of Lakulisa show him as holding a rod or a staff, because that's where the name comes from. Shiva goes on to say that his four sons slash disciples will be born in this yuga with four different names. This is how it is in the previous cycles of the yugas as well. In this yuga, where Krishna Dvaipayana is Vyasa and Shiva is entering into a dead body as Lakulisa, the names of these disciples is Kushika, Garga, Mitra, and Kaurushya. The Vayu Purana mentions the same story, but or a similar story with mild variations, but the names of the four ascetics is in this case Kushika, Garga, Mitraka, same as in Linga Purana. The last name instead of Kaurushya is Rusta. This is the only variation between the two Puranas. Now, this particular part is important because later, when we talk about the presence of Pasupata Shaivism in Southeast Asia, specifically in Bali, we will talk about these four disciples plus one that is mentioned by Shiva in the Puranas. But largely, you have this thing that yes, Shiva is born as Lakulisa, and it is a reanimated dead body, and subsequently there are disciples, and then you have the Pasupata sect emerging out of the Lakulisa Pasupata sect emerging out of it.
Okay. So basically, this part of it is fine in terms
This
of the
part is
founding of.
largely fine in the sense it talks about the emergence of the Pashupatas based on the story found in the Puranas.
Okay, sure. Then the next stage we move to the 7th century thing that you were saying, right?
Yes. At the same time, we'll also have to talk about yes, the 7th century source, the Deccan inscription that he talks about.
Yeah.
Now, as far as the Deccan inscription is concerned, fortunately, the author himself has seen it fit to link the source of the inscription, which is the book published by Epigraphia Indica, in providing a full list of the inscriptions that they have transcribed as well as elaborated upon. The link is in the article itself. I'm mentioning this because anybody who's keen enough can go ahead and look up the link themselves from the article. It mentions this inscription from 660 CE, where it talks about the ritual initiation, or as they would say in Shaivism, Diksha, for the Chalukya king Vikramaditya the first. It mentions that this initiation was done by the Pashupata Guru Sudarshana, for which he was granted the village of Ipparunkal. Then Sudarshana supposedly distributed the plots in the village to 27 Shaivite Brahmins. And then he mentions about how this region turned into a major Shaiva stronghold. Now, the problem here, the reason he has cited this paragraph, I mean, this, if you see, is the third paragraph under the heading Pashupata missionaries in India and abroad. And
Correct.
this
And
paragraph,
there is one paragraph above that on the Gangetic plain and the Gupta emperors also, but there is no source there in terms of spreading of the Pashupata sect over there, right?
there are
There's no
mentions
source.
of the presence of the Pashupatas in various inscriptions. I am willing to let that pass as long as it is limited to claiming that yes, Pashupatas were present in this region,
Okay.
and it can to some extent stretch the premise that Pashupata sect may have originated in Kaya Varohana, but then subsequently it spread in the Gangetic plain, and that may not have happened without active spreading by disciples. So,
Okay.
if that is the premise that the author wants to draw, I am willing to let that pass to a limited extent.
Sure. Okay.
But the next paragraph is very is something that cannot be allowed to let pass, primarily because the author makes an unequivocal, unambiguous claim that Sudarshana was a Pashupata guru. However, the source that he has cited for this is an inscription that talks about Vikramaditya I's Diksha. This is the Amudalapadu plates of Vikramaditya the first Chalukya. The problem with this is that the Amudalapadu plates in no part of the inscription claim that Sudarshanacharya was a Pashupata. That is the problem with that paragraph. That is a claim that the author has drawn out of thin air. He has found an inscription that talks about the Diksha of a king by a Shaiva Acharya. And he has extrapolated or projected his premise onto that poor Shaiva Acharya Sudarshana, saying that Sudarshana was a Pashupata guru. The problem with that is that if at least any one of the other 27 Brahmins to whom Sudarshana distributed plots, that part of the claim is correct. Sudarshana did distribute plots to 27 other acharyas who performed the ceremony with him. However, the Amudalapadu plates do not mention anything about if Sudarshana was a Pashupata or if any of the other 27 were Pashupatas.
So the other acharyas also, there is no mention that they are
No mention
Pashupatas.
whatsoever if they are Pashupatas. None whatsoever. There is no
Okay.
doubt about this.
Okay.
Neither Sudarshana nor the other 27, none of them, we don't know if they were Pashupatas. We don't know if they were not Pashupatas. It does not mention it
So
at all.
they could might as well also be Shaivas but not Pashupatas, right?
They were all Shaivas. That part is clear.
They were all Shaivas, but they could be non-Pashupata Shaivas as much as they
Absolutely.
can be Pashupatas.
Absolutely. This is the 7th century. So we already had other schools of Shaivism in
Correct.
existence.
Correct.
And one more point is that that inscription mentions that along with those 27 Brahmins, Sudarshana Acharya also distributed one plot of land to his wife. Now, that is omitted in the article by the author. Whether that's a conscious omission to continue with that claim that these were ash covered ascetics, a phrase that the author uses in the article, or how ash covered ascetics could have wives or wife for that matter, would be incongruent or out of character for an ash covered ascetic is was something that the author may have felt and therefore may have removed that particular mention from the inscription onto his article, or maybe he just I'm willing to give him the benefit of doubt that maybe he thought it was not relevant for this part and therefore he omitted it. However, the inscription does mention that one plot of land was given to Sudarshanacharya's wife. Let's put that on record here.
Okay. So just one question here.
Yeah.
So Shaiva ascetics cannot have wives, or is it based on which sect, or is there anything like that?
No, but the point that the author makes is that these were ash covered ascetics.
Which means that they had to be brahmacharis.
Ascetics.
Okay. Got it.
So, and then, based on this particular premise, which he has drawn about Sudarshana Acharya being a Pashupata, which is patently not valid, he says it is in this context that we now turn to Cambodia, which is a sort of a sleight of hand that your regular town fair magician tries to pull on you, because your primary premise of Sudarshanacharya being a Pashupata itself is not corroborated. So you cannot use that faulty premise to turn to Cambodia or wherever else for that matter. Nevertheless, he goes ahead to turn to Cambodia. Okay. Now, in Cambodia, he talks about there being existence of several centers of Shiva worship, which is right, yes, and that these were centered around mountains and natural stone columns. They may not have been centered around that; they may have been centered around other places as well. However, the evidence we have today is from these parts, which are relatively less approachable and less prone to rapid urbanization.
Okay.
Now, he says that Pashupatas may have arrived on these shores as early as the 5th century, with the earliest epigraphic evidence dating to the 7th century, largely acceptable.
Okay.
However, the next paragraph is another faulty premise where he says the Cambodian embrace of Pashupata missionaries was also tied to their beliefs about rulership. Now, the problem is he makes a particular statement specific to the Pashupatas. However, he goes on to talk about gaining magical power with, Pasupata concept of gaining magical power through Shaivite ritual. Then, after making these two specific claims, claim one being that the Cambodian embrace of Pasupata missionaries was connected to their ideas about rulership, and the number two claim that Pasupata concept of gaining magical power through Shaivite ritual. After making these two claims, he goes on from the specific of Pashupata to the general of Shaiva. I'll tell you why this is important in a bit. Where he says that Shiva temples were commissioned, not Pashupata Shiva temples, generally Shiva temples, to make Shiva a Cambodian god and Cambodia a Shaivite land. Now, why this is important is that two paragraphs down the line, he talks about when young King Jayavarman set out to establish the empire of Angkor, he conducted a ritual with a Brahmin priest Hiranyadama. Now, he has already made claims about the concept of Pashupata missionaries being embraced by the rulers because it tied into their belief about rulership. However, the substantiation that he quotes subsequently of the young King Jayavarman, to begin with, we don't know if the King Jayavarman was young at the time of this ritual or not. Okay, simply adding an adjective to a name does not really provide you with additional knowledge about said person. Okay,
Okay.
this was Jayavarman the second. Okay, and he performed this ritual with the priest Hiranyadama. We have this on record. Okay, however, we also have on record that Hiranyadama developed a paddhati, which the author also claims. What we don't have on record was that Hiranyadama was a Pashupata. He was not. The Paddhati was drawn based on texts of the Mantra Marga of Shaivism, which is not the Marga from which Pashupatism comes. It is from the Pashupatism comes from the Ati Marga, the other one, not the Mantra Marga.
Okay, so one question here, Jay, but later in the article he does mention about Mantra Marga.
He
So,
does mention about Mantra Marga, but you see, what I'm trying to show here is that
hmm,
he has made a claim that the the idea of Cambodian embrace of Pashupata missionaries was tied to their belief about rulership, that
okay,
rulers could lead men and win battles, were believed to be spiritually gifted, and that this idea worked well with Pashupata concept of gaining magical power through Shaivite ritual.
okay.
If it is a Pashupata, if the concept of gaining magical power through Shaivite ritual is essentially a Pashupata concept, why are we talking about a Mantra Marga Paddhati that was composed by Hiranyadama for Jayavarman II? So you see the dissonance here. First, you say that it was a Pashupata concept, but the substantiation you provide for it is essentially a Mantra Marga ritual that was performed. A Mantra Marga text from which a Paddhati was drawn up by Hiranyadama.
Okay. Got it.
Okay, and the next part is the year of performing this ceremony for King Jayavarman is made in the article as 802 CE. Okay, the source for this is the Stokoktom inscription, which comes from 2.5 centuries later. Okay, that inscription, despite being a later source, is very useful because it provides information about several rulers of Jayavarman's line, Jayavarman the second. Okay, now the inscription itself is from 1052 CE, after Rajendra Chola's time, if you want to draw a contemporary timeline with what was happening in India. Okay, now that inscription mentions that Hiranyadama extracted the essence of four texts which were from Vamatantra. Okay, a completely different school of thought, which is the Mantra Marga. Now, these texts were the Siracheda, Nayottara, Vinashika, and Sammoha. Okay, none of these are related to Pasupata Shaivism. The author is also careful enough in claiming that these were Mantra Marga. The only problem is that the dissonance with the earlier claim of it being a Pashupata concept of gaining magical power through Shaivite ritual. Now, moving on, he makes subsequent claims about that these texts make reveal something fascinating about medieval Shaivism. That Mantramarga practitioners were technically supposed to base their paddhatis on agamas of their own school and lineage, but in practice, due to the need to fulfill the ritual demands of their royal customers, the vocabulary used here, royal customers, to meet ritual demands of royal customers, they very often melded together multiple lineages in their paddhatis. Going back, the source he has cited is again the ceremony performed by Hiranyadama. Okay, there is no melding of paddhatis that has been done there. He is a mantra margin, and all the texts he has used are mantra marga texts. So essentially, you are making a claim while providing a false substantiation for it.
So here is how I understand it, Jay. The claim made is that Pasupata was the more missionary sect. Mantra Marga comes in. This is the claim that is made in the article. It has its own version of Shaivism, but it adopts certain practices of Pashupata so that it can become missionary. This is my understanding of what it is. But you're saying that is not the case because it's firstly not going with that intention because it's not taking any of the Pasupata sect practices into the Mantra Marga sect. Correct,
The paddhati that
right?
has been prepared has been made fully based on the mantra marga texts that Hiranyadama has consulted, which is mentioned in the Tom inscription by itself.
Okay, got it.
I'll mention the name of the inscription. It is mentioned in my thread as well. It is called the
Sure.
Zdok Kak Thom inscription of 1052 CE. The
Okay.
purpose of the ceremony was to free Cambodia Desa, to which Jayavarman II was the king. The objective was to free Cambodia Desa from Java's control.
Okay. Now, I have another question which really piqued my curiosity. It has been said that Shiva was being made into a Cambodian god, and then this point is coming that there was colonization,
Yeah.
right? Two. Number three, in that end of this paragraph that you were reading, a point is made that oddly we have little evidence that Southeast Asians ever visited Hindu sacred sites in India, but plenty of evidence of the converse. So now my point is a colonized people, like the colonizing people, are going to the sacred site of the colonized.
Yeah.
So which means that the if this hypothesis is true, please run with this hypothesis with me. The
Yeah.
stronger power is going to the sacred sites of the weaker power. The weaker power is not doing the same with the stronger power. So
Yeah.
this colonization bit is not fitting.
Yeah. So you see, if you were to
and
draw
and
a
one more point, Shiva is a Cambodian god, so that again actually disapproves the colonization bit, because if it is colonization it has to be an Indian god
Indian
whom we
import,
are imposing you, and you have to follow that Indian god. Something, it's not fitting with the pointers. With There is a lack of internal consistency itself is what I see.
there is a lack of internal consistency in several aspects, several parts of the article, as we have discussed. Um, okay, let me put it to you this way. Let me put it to you based on the sources that we have as to what happened. To some extent, the picture that is being drawn based on the limited sources that we had. So the thing is, we have to look at, even if we were to look at Cambodia itself, because that is the area to which most of the article in the print is dedicated. So if we were to look at Cambodia itself, originally you had a set of Khmer principalities from which emerges the Angkor. Okay, so to answer the question about there being a native identity, a Cambodian Shiva as it is claimed, if we were to look at what we have, the evidence that we have in hand is that in the pre-Angkor period, more than two-thirds of the lingas that were installed, these were given names of various forms of Shiva, the same names as you would find in famous pilgrimage sites, or the names of Shiva from famous pilgrimage sites in India. So the entire idea was to create a double or a mirror of existing sacred spaces that are in India. For example, the King Isana Varman the First. Okay, Isanavarman the first, his capital city was called Isanapura. The name itself, Isanavarman itself, shows that he was a Shaivite. Okay, the name of his city was Isanapura, and the name of the Shiva in that city was Prahasiteswara, which was the same name given to Shiva in the temple at Pataliputra when it existed. So the entire idea was to create doubles or mirrors of existing temples of Shiva in India. Similar to the, let's say, we both come from Tamil Nadu, so there you have that a temple in Tenkasi. Now,
Southern Kashi.
yeah, southern Kashi. The Sthala Purana of that, of course, says that Shiva spoke to the ruler that my temple in Kashi is no longer functioning. It has been destroyed, so build a temple for me in Tenkasi. And that is how the temple comes about.
Same with Madurai and Mathura.
Yeah. So you see, the concept of creating doubles or mirrors of existing sacred spaces was already happening in India, and the same phenomenon manifested itself in Southeast Asia as well. Okay. Now, not just names of temples, but also concepts. We'll get to that in a bit. While I'll briefly touch upon the existence of a temple called Linga Parvata. Okay, this today is known as the Mount Fukau. This mountain itself, there was a temple to Shiva, there was a linga in the Linga Parvata, of course. But that aside, the Linga Parvata itself was considered to be a manifestation of Shiva and was worshipped accordingly. The same way you have in Tiruvannamalai, where the hill itself, the hill of Tiruvannamalai itself, Arunachaleswara, itself is considered to be a manifestation of Shiva, which is why you have the concept of Girivalam, where you don't go just around the temple, but around the entire hill. And then you come to the last paragraph in the article where it talks about, I mean, it makes several lofty claims where it begins by saying, what can we really say about medieval Cambodia's relationship with India? Then what it does is that it once again tries to draw parallels from various other eras and various completely different niche and pin that onto Shaivism and more specifically Pasupata sect of Shaivism, where he says, just like European military advisors in early modern India were working with the wealthier princely states that existed here, wealthier kingdoms, let's say, not princely states, the wealthier kingdoms that existed in India and were willing to adjust themselves to their patrons' culture and needs. Similarly, Indians also went to Southeast Asia. Now, this is, like I said, conjecture without any basis or substantiation. We do not know if the author has any substantiation for this or any primary sources that he has stashed away secretly and does not want to reveal to the world. But as far as the article itself is concerned, we don't see any of that being mentioned there. He has merely made claims without providing any sort of substantiation. So, the problem with the entire article is that there are tall claims for which there is no substantiation, and the substantiation provided in places is also faulty. So if the crux of your article is about Pashupata missionaries in India and abroad, I would expect that you provide some sort of a primary source that at least remotely mentions Pashupata missionaries or even Pashupata itself. We don't see that happening anywhere. None of the sources that the author has cited have any reference to Pashupata. Okay, as we have said, Sudarshanacharya, there is nothing to say that he was a Pashupata. The subsequent citation of Hiranyadama, which the author itself is clear was not Pashupata. Okay, and then you have the part which I think we skipped over, where he says that the Paddhati composed by Hiranyadama was a detailed ritual manual that became the basis of the Devaraja cult. Okay, now the Devaraja cult is associated or is based on the premise that the king was associated with Shiva, and that Shiva was, or the king was worshipped as the king of the gods, because when it says worshipped him, I see a H in the small case, so therefore I assume that it refers to the king and not Shiva.
Correct.
So the problem with that is that association of the ruler with a god, it is not the first time that it is happening, and it is not in Hiranyadama's Paddhati that we see it for the first time. Now, as the article itself mentions, the Paddhati was composed in 802 CE when this ceremony happened for Jayavarman II. Okay? But going back by 400 years before 802 CE, you have the Sieruthion inscription that comes from much south. It comes from Tarumanagara, okay, of a king called Purnavarman. Now, the inscription talks about Purnavarman. It gives him various adjectives such as powerful, illustrious, brave, etc. And then it says that this king Purnavarman of Tarumanagara, his foot soles were the same as those of God Vishnu. Understandably, this is not Shaivism, it is Vaishnavism. However, the association of ruler with a god, be it Shiva or Vishnu, has happened at least 400 years before this Paddhati composed by Hiranyadama. Okay, now there are three rulers that we have talked about right now. As of now, we'll be talking about more rulers later, but as of now, we've spoken about three rulers. One is the Chalukya king Vikramaditya the first in India. The Acharya associated with this is not a Pasupata. We have no evidence to call him a Pasupata. You have the Angkor king Jayavarman II, 802 CE. The Acharya associated is Hiranyadama, a Mantra Margin. Okay, you have a third king who is Purnavarman of the Siyaruthiyan inscription that I mentioned, which goes back 400 years before the Paddhati of Hiranyadama, who is most definitely not Shaivite, let alone Pashupata. He's a Vaishnavite.
He's a
So in none of
Vaishnavite.
yeah, because the foot soles of Purnavarman are compared with those of Vishnu.
Oh. So the first one, we don't have any evidence that he's. Second one you mentioned?
Second one is Jayavarman the second, who the author himself acknowledges was a mantra margin.
Correct. And the third one is a Vaishnavite.
Third one, the king that I mentioned, Purnavarman of Tarumanagara, who was a Vaishnavite. Okay. Now, if we were to look at Pashupata presence itself in Southeast Asia, we have several different sources, none of which, unfortunately, the author has managed to cite. Okay. None of everything that I have said thus far, be it about the various sects of Shaivism present in Southeast Asia, none of this is to deny that Pashupatas were present in Southeast Asia. They were very much present. We have several sources that mention that they were present. Okay. Now, you remember the four sages who were disciples of Lakulisa that Shiva mentions in the Linga Purana? I will reiterate that these were say ascetics whose names were Kushika, Garga, Mitra, and Kaurusya. These are names that are mentioned in the Linga Purana where Shiva says that they will be born and they will be my disciples, as in Shiva's disciples. Okay. Now, take these four sages in Southeast Asia. Another name is added to this four. Okay, this name is either Pratanjala or Patanjala. We don't know for sure based on reading of the inscription. Okay, it is most likely Pratanjala. Okay, now these five, the four that we mentioned earlier, plus Pratanjala, are venerated together as Pancha Rishis or the Pancha Kushikas. The first one of the four was Kushika. So these together are named after him as the Pancha Kushikas. Okay. Now, how do we know this? There is a manuscript which incidentally is related to Buddhism. Okay. It is the Kunjarakarna manuscript which draws a parallel between the five Tathagatas who are sacred to Mahayana Buddhism. Okay, and these Panchakusikas who are sacred to the Pashupata Rishi sect in Java. So the Kunjarakarana manuscript essentially says that just like you have these five Tathagatas who are sacred to Mahayana Buddhism, you have these Panchakusikas who are equally sacred to the Panchakushika sect in Java of the Pashupata Rishis. Okay, now along with that, you also have inscriptions which mention these five as divine witnesses that are present during the signing of peace treaties. Okay? Now, if you were to draw a parallel with that, with something that we have already been familiar with, the Mittani peace treaty that we have from northwest of what was at that point India and what we now know as Iran. Okay. Now, in the Mittani peace treaty, you have Mitra, Varuna, and other Vedic deities present as witnesses to that peace, as Sakshi, let's say. Similarly, you have peace treaties in this part of the world, in Southeast Asia, where these five, the Panchakusikas that I mentioned, are signing off as divine witnesses. Okay? Similarly, if you were to go into the Kakavin Ramayana, the story of Ramayana that you have in Java, or the Javanese Ramayana as we would colloquially call it, it describes the entry of Ravana to that hut where Sita is staying. Okay, Ravana appears disguised as a Shaiva monk. Now that is important to us because the Kakavin Ramayana goes into great detail into describing this appearance of Ravana as a Shaiva monk. Is, that he had a shaved head, that he had a tuft of hair. It describes in great detail, which shows that when the Kakavin Ramayana was being composed, and this was in the 10th and the 11th centuries, when this was being composed, the people who were doing the composing were fully aware of what a Shaiva monk looked like. Okay,
Correct.
and then another inscription from the 7th century, okay, which is 2 centuries before the inscription that the author has mentioned, Jayavarman II and Hiranyadama, the Sudokok Tom inscription, which is again from 1052, but the incident it mentions happens in 802 CE. Okay, but going back centuries before that, you have a Khmer principality ruler, Bhavavarman II. Okay, he comes in the 7th century. To some extent, we can call him a contemporary of Harshavardhana in India. Okay.
Okay.
Now, Bhavavarman II, in his Nom Pra inscription, mentions a person named Vidya Pushpa. Now, Vidya Pushpa was a member of his court. And this is important because Vidya Pushpa is not mentioned as the king's guru. We have kings who had Shaiva gurus. Like, for example, the ruler that the author has mentioned, Jayavarman II, had a guru called Siva Kaivalya. How do we know this? Because the same inscription, which talks about Hiranyadama performing that ceremony and writing down a Paddhati, Hiranyadama then goes on to educate this Guru Shiva Kaivalya of Jayavarman II about various rituals and aspects that have to be performed. Okay, so kings did have Shaiva gurus like Shiva Kaivalya. However, if we have to look at a clear presence of Pasupata, the reference that we have is of Vidya Pushpa, who is a member of the king's court. He's not a minister, he's not a guru to the king, he's a member of the king's court. Okay? Now, Vidya Pushpa is considered to be a scholar of Nyaya, Vaisheshika, and Shabda. Okay? Vidya Pushpa goes on to establish a linga in the Tungisa Parvata in that part of the world. Okay? We also have references that there was a Pashupata ashrama in a place called Tep Pranam, which is close to the capital city of Angkor. Okay? Now, there is another inscription. This is by Ishanavarman I, again from early 7th century. Okay? Now, this is called the Sambor Prey Cook inscription of Ishanavarman I, which mentions the Pashupatas. Okay? Now, this opens with an invocation to Kadambeshwara. Again, another name of Shiva, which you would find in India, Kadambeshwara. We had the Kadamba dynasty. Remember, now just like the Hoysalas had a Hoysaleshwara, you would have had the Kadambas having a Kadambeshwara. Now there was a Kadambeshwara to whom the inscription is dedicated because it opens with an invocation to Kadambeshwara and also talks about a person called Vidya Visesha, also a Pashupata. Vidya Visesha, just like Vidya Pushpa has done, Vidya Pushpa establishes a Shivalinga in the Tungisa Parvata. Vidya Visesha establishes a Shivalinga. We don't know the location, that is not mentioned, but this Shivalinga was installed in 627 CE during the reign of the king Ishanavarman I. Okay? Thus, we have a clear-cut mention of the presence of Pashupatas. We have several references of various other schools of Shaivism also present in this part of the world. Okay? These 2 points are not connected in any way to the active conversion by Pashupata missionaries, driven by market forces, or monks catering to royal customers. We don't have proof of any of this. But these exactly are the claims that the author makes. So, to give an example of something that I'm familiar with, if you take competitive exams in India, there is a particular format of a question where you have a claim being made as an assertion and you have a substantiation being provided as the reason. Okay. Now, you have to decide whether the assertion and the reason are both correct and if indeed the reason explains the assertion made. Okay, now this is the actual test. Here we have several assertions being made, part of which can be accepted because there was a Pasupata presence in Southeast Asia. However, the reasons provided by the author or the substantiation that he has provided for these claims do not hold any water. Okay, these are just claims that he has made because he felt like making, perhaps, because these don't match up. The substantiation you provide has to match up to the claim that you make. I can't say that it is a cold cloudy day in Belarus and then say New Delhi is the capital of India. These two don't connect. Okay, which is what unfortunately the author has done. And then the last paragraph of that article is merely conjecture and more conjecture. It does not have any, he has not provided any substantiation. Based on everything else that he has written in the body of the article, we don't get anything that explains this last claim that he has made. It is what it
What
is.
are these market forces? I'm not clear. What is the
I
market force?
I would have really hoped that the author would have explained what he meant when he said market forces drove people there. However, nothing is mentioned at that point of time.
And also the whole part on colonization that I mentioned, it just doesn't add up at all. Like,
At all. No, it doesn't.
yeah,
The claims that are made here, where he says, where the forces of the market and the agency of the patrons were as alive as they are today. One where, see, the penultimate phrase in the entire article is the actual objective of the author, okay? Where he
today.
says, one where Indian religions were no different in their fundamental impulses to any other. This is the claim that the author wants to make, where he wants to take Indian religions and say, do not be holier than thou, you were no different from anybody else. But if that is the claim you want to make, you would have to provide some substantiation that this was the case as with everywhere else. But no such substantiation is provided here. If
But
you were to do this comparison, for example, you will have to say that the missionaries that went from India, missionaries, quote unquote, that went from India to Southeast Asia, were part of organized units, just like the missionaries which came from elsewhere to India. Either they were part of a larger religious unit which dispatched missionaries all over the world, or for that we have reference from Ashoka itself, where one of his inscriptions says that he dispatched Dharma Mahamatras or Dhamma Mahamattas, because it is in Pali. Dhamma Mahamattas were dispatched all over various parts of the country and
Sri
abroad.
Lanka,
And yeah, his
Greece.
own son and daughter were sent to Sri Lanka. So we have those references from Ashoka, where you have a royal organization that dispatches these missionaries, or it could be a religious organization. Okay, we don't have the evidence or primary source proof to make either of these claims in the case of Pashupata Shaivism. No king has dispatched Pasupata missionaries to other parts of Southeast Asia. No, there is no church of Pasupatism that has
Yeah,
dispatched
is
these.
there any ashram or any pontiff who has that commanding authority to issue something like a papal bull, or say that, is there anything like that? I'm just trying to brainstorm, like I'm just trying to understand what
We don't
other,
have for any of this. So we can't make
because
that claim without proof. Simply, you cannot take something from somewhere and transplant it into this and say this was the same as that. It doesn't work that way.
exactly. And it also intuitively, the decentralized nature of the different,
Of
you
this
know
religion itself and of the various
it
branches of
doesn't add
it.
up that somebody is sitting somewhere planning where to plant certain sects and darshanas, and then, you know and also someone who belongs to a nyaya or a vaishashika darshana, which is supposed to be a
Exactly.
logical, logic based rational school of Indic thought.
Hmm.
It just completely is counterintuitive that that person would go and proselytize or anything like that. I mean, it's
Exactly. So you have all these claims being made, but you don't have any substantiation for any of those. And if you were to draw a parallel, you will have to show that the setup was the same there and the setup was the same here. I mean, mere proximity to a ruler does not mean that the ruler dispatched missionaries to other parts of the world. These are two different things. Okay? You can have Sudarshana Acharya, who is not a Pasupata, I repeat. You can have Sudarshana Acharya perform a ceremony for Chalukya Vikramaditya the first, and also have Chalukya Vikramaditya the first not sponsor dispatching Shaivite missionaries to other parts of the country. Both are valid because we have no evidence of the latter. We don't have anything that says Chalukya Vikramaditya the first sent out Shaivite missionaries to actively go convert people in other parts.
so I have two questions that come to my mind, Jay. The first one, because this is obviously this is in the author's defense, this is not something he has mentioned in the article, but this is part of the larger public discourse that Saivas are not Hindus, Cholas are Saivas but not Hindus. Hindu Shaivism different, Hinduism did not exist, it's a modern, all that, right? So, in fact, this article, to the author's credit, actually debunks that because it clearly states in the headline India's Hindu preachers, how Shaiva monks converted Cambodia. So, this article literally says, at least this article debunks that Shaivism is actually Hinduism. This doesn't fit with the larger discourse happening outside, right? What
Yes.
is your take on this?
Okay, so let's get into that muddled ground, or the ground that has recently been made more muddled. Now, let's, because we have been discussing Southeast Asia for a while now. Let me just say that you have found hundreds of inscriptions in Southeast Asia. Okay, in Khmer itself, in Cambodia itself, you have inscriptions that are bilingual, that have a part of it in Sanskrit and a part of it in Khmer language. Okay, there are long inscriptions that go into 300 verses with around 190 of that in Sanskrit itself. Okay, moving on, the opening lines of these Sanskrit inscriptions, especially in the case of rulers who were Shaivites themselves, the inscriptions pay obeisance to more deities, not just Shiva. Okay, the principal deity being Shiva is mentioned in the beginning. After venerating Shiva, these inscriptions pay obeisance to Vishnu, to Brahma, to Uma, and Saraswati. Okay. Now, when the king Rajendra Varman, not the Rajendra Chola we have here, but let's say a century and a half before Rajendra Chola, you have Rajendra Varman who installs a linga called Rajendreshwara and another linga called Rajendra Bhadreshwara. But in that temple, he also installs images of Gauri, Vishnu, and Shiva. Okay? Now, the Mahabharata in the Shanti Parva mentions various paths as valid. Okay? Now, this is the Vedic path. Then it mentions Sankhya, Yoga, Pasupata, as well as Pancharatra. Now, Pancharatra is Vaishnavism, we know that. As far as the relations between these religions is concerned, Shaiva temples in Southeast Asia have icons and murtis of Vishnu, Brahma, Saraswati, and others. Okay, and let's come back to India for a moment. Okay, the temple town of Kanchipuram has a temple called the Tirumetraleswarar temple. Okay, now this Tirumetraleswarar temple interestingly has two lingas. Okay, the first linga is Shiva, obviously. The second linga is actually Vishnu. It is one of those rare instances where
Vishnu
Vishnu.
Linga.
Yes. Now that is why I brought this temple up, because so many Shiva temples may have sannadhis or shrines to Vishnu, but that's, this one would be a very interesting example in the sense that as per the Sthala Purana, we have Vishnu worshipping Shiva in this temple and wanting to become one with Shiva in that rupa, okay? Because you have the various stages of bhakti where you have salokya, wherein you attain to the same loka or the same world or the same plane, and then you have samipya, which is getting near, okay? And then you have sarupya, or attaining the same form. And then the final stage is one of sayujya, which is complete union, okay? So in this Sarupya level is where Vishnu wants to attain the same form. Okay. Now he is involved in bhakti towards Shiva for a very long time, aeons and aeons, until you have, because this temple is also what we call a Padal Pettu Sthalam, in the sense you have the Nayanmar monks who have sung songs to the temple. Okay, so you have Tirunjana Sambandar who sings a Patigam or a Padal in this temple, upon hearing which, the song is so beautifully dipped deep in devotion that upon hearing this itself, Vishnu's form melts. Vishnu melts away. He melts away into a linga. Okay? And because that melting process is not complete, there is a vestige. This Thiruvetradiswara temple has two lingas. One is the Shiva linga, as I said. The second linga has 2 feet at the bottom because it was Vishnu who was melting into a linga, but that process stopped towards the end where his 2 feet have been left behind. Okay? Now you could ask, even if it is Vishnu, how it is that we can have a linga, or Vishnu being worshipped as a linga. The thing here is, in Kamika Agama, one of the Shaiva Siddhantika Agamas, there is a part called Bhakta Pratishta, where a devotee considered worthy enough and holy enough could be worshipped as a linga in a temple. In this case, Vishnu itself being the Bhakta, you have Bhakta Pratishta of Vishnu in the Thiruvetradiswara temple in accordance with the Kamikagama, where he
Wow.
is worshipped. Okay? And of course, if you go back to the Vishnu Sahasranama, which comes in the Mahabharata, you have a part in the Vishnu Sahasranama where Shiva tells Parvati. Okay? Now you had an instance where you have Vishnu worshipping Shiva in a Shiva temple. Let's look at it from the other end. Okay? You have Shiva telling Parvati, where he says, if you want to get the benefit of chanting all 1000 names of Vishnu, which is the Vishnu Sahasranama, if you want to get the benefit of all of this, there is only one name that you need to chant, which is the name of Sri Rama. This is the popular sloka that we all know, Sri Rama Rama Rameti Rame Rame Manorame. Where the Manorama in this shloka is actually Parvati. Shiva talks to Parvati, addressing her as Manorama. And he says, Sahasranama Tatulyam, the equivalent of the Sahasranama, Ramanama Varanane, in worshipping the name of just Ramanama.
Wow. Oh.
So you see, this worked both ways. So it is very intriguing that people attempt to put Shaivism and Vaishnavism into complete silos, while both of them draw from the core foundation of the Vedic texts. I mean, this may match their worldview, which is slightly, let's say, limited based on what they see from today's context. And I had written something about this on Twitter as well, where this is something that is unique to India, where we try to see some of the deities of our own polytheism as being antagonistic to each other, or their followers being limited to silos from each other. The example that I had drawn was, if you would take the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, you wouldn't ask if he worshipped this Roman god or that Roman god. Okay? Nobody would ask if the Pharaoh Ramses worshipped this Egyptian god or that Egyptian god. Nobody's asking if Eric the Red, the great Viking, worshipped Odin or Thor. We just, none of these primary religions ended up defining the names of their religion, which is why we coined the names. We call it the Greek religion, the Roman religion, or the Norse religion for that matter. None of them have names that to them it was just their religion. They didn't want to give it a name because to them it was the only thing that they had grown up in. you
It was
know
a way of life. It was a
it
way
was a
of
way of
life.
life, and it
And
was.
and this is almost like the monotheistic gaze at the polytheist. Because you can only think of one central deity, you take that projection and you put that in polytheism, that, oh, others, the polytheists also have one central deity and they reject other deities and the others are inferior. This is
You see,
almost that.
there is a Sanskrit word to describe this particular phenomenon. We're all aware of it. In English, we call it the frog in the well. In Sanskrit, we call it Kupa Manduka. Because the frog has grown up only in the well and has seen nothing else but the well all its life. It begins to see, when you have a frog coming in from a bigger, let's say, a river. When the river frog tries to describe the river, the well frog keeps asking, is it 10 times the size of my well? Is it 15 times? It cannot think of anything outside the well construct. It only understands the well, and therefore to it, the world can only be seen as 50 times bigger than the well or 100 times bigger than the well. It cannot see the world as something so huge and so different that it cannot be defined in terms of the well itself. So, similar to that, you have these people who have grown up only in the Abrahamic milieu, and therefore their gaze is determined by this prism of Abrahamism, where they have one particular deity or one only deity, the only true God concept of Abrahamic monotheisms.
Correct. But one thing I want to ask you, Jay, because now we've identified that this whole missionary zeal was not really the case in Southeast Asia. How, what is your hypothesis in terms of the sources you have as to how Hinduism went there?
Okay. So for this, we have mentions in inscriptions itself. There is one mention of Ern Agastya, not the Agastya, but Ern Agastya, which actually means a descendant of Agastya. Could be in that Gotra or lineage in which Agastya hails, a descendant of Agastya who goes to Southeast Asia, and his learning, his knowledge of philosophy and various schools of theology is considered to be so impressive that he is not only accommodated but honored. Okay, he ends up marrying a member of the royal family, and the theory is that it is through him that the religion has spread in that part of the world. This is one concept. Of course, it could not be a case of a single progenitor who spread it across the place. It would have been a sustained flow of people, similar to, for example, let's say the region of Pagan in Burma or Myanmar. Now they had a strong presence of Vaishnavism. Okay, but going further south, we see that it is Shaivism that continues to dominate. Okay, now as far as we have it, we based on the inscription evidence that we have, we see that Southeast Asia received Shaivism in two waves. Okay, in the early centuries, it was the Ati Marga, of which Pasupata was a part, that reached Southeast Asia, which is why you have some of the early lingas without the yoni pita around the linga. Okay. Subsequently, from around the 8th to 9th centuries till about the 14th century, you have the mantra marga, mostly of the Shaiva Siddhantikas, that goes to Southeast Asia. Okay, and then you have the lingas which have the yoni pita around them. Okay, but this is only seen based on some of the inscriptions. What we see is that these two were not antagonistic to each other, in the sense they mixed and mingled, and some of the ritual ceremonies were actively a combination. Okay, now where did
Okay,
it
Jay, just one point, because we previously mentioned that there was no combination.
no, no, no. What we did mention was that in the rituals that were performed for the kings, there was no combination. In this particular
Oh,
ritual that Hiranyadama wrote out a Paddhati for, there was no combination. That was drawn from four
that's
texts, all
specific
of which,
instance.
yeah, that specific instance, all these texts were Mantra Marga. And you
Okay,
see,
okay, got it.
yeah, and you see, it takes a while for the Mantra Marga's texts and sects and their practices to root themselves in Southeast Asia. Okay?
Okay.
And Shaivism, we don't know if it reached Southeast Asia from a single source. It is most likely that it reached Southeast Asia from multiple parts of the country, mostly at around the same time and also at different times. Okay. What we do know is that the text of Mahabharata most likely reached Southeast Asia from the south of India. Why? Because the verses from the Mahabharata cited in inscriptions. Okay. For example, there is an inscription. Now, for this, we need to move from Cambodia to Vietnam, where you have the charms. Okay. The Meson steel inscription of King Vikrantavarman. Now, this is late 7th, early 8th century. Okay. Now, this particular inscription mentions the Tripurantaka episode where Shiva, as Tripurantaka, destroys the three cities. Okay. Now, this episode, the details that are mentioned in this particular inscription come from the Drona Parva of the southern recension of the Mahabharata. And that is how we understand that it is this recension of the Mahabharata that reached Southeast Asia. Okay. And subsequently, we have the name Cambodia Desa itself. It is a name given in Sanskrit, which means Sanskrit had already become not only common and prevalent, but also considered to be sufficiently high bhasha enough for them to name their kingdom in that language. Okay. Now, despite Shaivism being predominant in both Cambodia Desa as well as in Vietnam, we also find several references of Pancharatrika Vaishnavism and also a developed form of the Mahayana Buddhism. Okay, now Shaivism was predominant all over Cambodia Desa, and in fact, the earlier instance of Ishanapura. In fact, Huint Sang, when he visits this region, he does not call the kingdom by any other name, not by the name Cambodia Desa. He actually calls it by the name of Ishanapura, by the name of its capital.
Oh,
Yeah, and that is the extent to which Shaivism had become prevalent. Okay, now in terms of common features, to say, if we have to say that what aspects of Shaivism got transported from India to Southeast Asia, we have inscriptions that talk about establishing and also restoration of temples and deities, contributions made to hermitages, and also contributions made not only by royalty but also local leaders and high dignitaries who give land, cattle, also tools of rituals. Like, we also have references here of kings or merchants donating. When I say tool of ritual, what I mean is that, let's say, a brass lamp to the temple, or something to perform a particular ritual with. Now, towards the Angkor period, when the Khmer principalities coalesce into the Angkor period, we have references that a Shaiva Diksha was given to a ruler at the same time as his Rajya Abhisheka. Which means as soon as he was coronated, as part of it, there was a Shaiva Diksha. Now, this was done to the king, even if his personal belief was to Vaishnavism. Okay. That is how prevalent Shaivism had become at that point of time in Cambodia Desa. Okay. Now, the number of the temples, the size of the temples, and the inscription that mentioned their endowments, all this put together shows us that the temples were the centers of political, economic, and cultural life of the society, just like it was in India. Okay. Now, there is a Lole inscription. This is by the king Yashovarman the First. Okay, he is in the late 9th century, where you have him mentioning that in the temple, other than the regular rituals, music and dance were present, and these were, very popular among the people. The inscription also mentions that the temple served free meals to the worshippers. Every time we read something like this, we don't know if the writer is speaking about the south of India or Southeast Asia, because that's how common it is. That's how similar it is. Okay?
okay.
Now, the Khmer kingdoms subsequently went ahead and developed their own paddhati for religious rituals, which is why I said to some extent, the Cambodian Shaivism attempted to indigenize itself in local rituals, which again we see in various parts of the country. The flowers that you offer for worship in the north are not the same flowers you have in the south. There are slight variations. So these paddhatis were evolutions of the original text that came from India. These in no form, shape, or case denied the original text that came from India. They acknowledged the validity of these texts and then drew or evolved from them,
Innovated. Yeah.
innovated from them. They did not in any place deny the text that came from India. Okay, so the word that they use for these paddhatis itself is a word that comes from Sanskrit. The word is panji, the same as the word panjika in Sanskrit, or as most Hindi speakers would recognize, the word panjikaran for registration. Okay, we have such a panjika that is composed by somebody named Brahma Shambhu, in the year 938 CE for Shiva worship. And there are, these are not paddhatis that are composed only by religious leaders like Brahma Shambhu, or for that matter Hiranyadama. Okay, because we have a ruler Udayaditya Varman II, who mentions that his predecessor Surya Varman the first. Now Surya Varman the first is very important because he had relations with Rajaraja Chola. In fact, he sent a golden war chariot to Rajaraja Chola. He was a contemporary of Rajaraja Chola and also his son Rajendra Chola. Now, Suryavarman the first also composed a Paddhati for Shiva worship. And just like you have in India, where where the deity and the temple in Tanjavur, as we now know, is Brihadishvara. But the original name is Rajarajeshwara because it was built and consecrated by Rajaraja the first. Okay, so just like Rajaraja built Rajarajeshwara or Gangeganda Cholishwara by his son, you have here temples that are built in the names of the kings. So you have Indravarman building Indravarmeshwara. You also have a linga consecrated as Prithivindreshwara, named after Prithivindra. So you have all these similarities that almost could be talking about one part or the other. Unless you know what I'm talking about, you won't know which part I'm talking about because it is so similar. It could might as well be done here. Okay, so you also have all these kings mentioning that there are scholars in their court who are scholars not only of the Shaiva texts, like for example, there is a king Rajendra Varman. Okay, he is from his reign is from 944 CE to 968 CE. He is supposed to have performed various Soma sacrifices. So, at one instance, you may say that it is Shaivism, but no, the Soma sacrifice is a distinctly Shrauta ritual. It comes directly from the Vedas, from the Shruti. Okay. Now, this king Rajendra Varman studied Vimamsa from somebody named Someshwara Bhatta. And this king is supposed to be an expert in the 18 Vyavahara Pada of Manusmriti. You also have several mentions of Manusmriti and several rulers being fully aware of or knowledgeable or learned in Manusmriti. Okay. There are rulers such as Jayavarman, who is mentioned as Vedapriya Mahibhratam, somebody who was dedicated or who loved the Vedas, Vedapriya. Okay. Now, this Jayavarman is the same one that you have the author having mentioned in this sect, Jayavarman the second. That is who he has mentioned in his article. Jayavarman is called as Vedapriya Mahibhratam in one of his inscriptions.
So, Jay, I want to ask you, are the rulers embracing Hinduism first and then the general population, or is the population also getting into Dharma and the rulers are responding to that? Like, what is preceding what?
So we do not have, as far as I am aware, I may be wrong here, we do not have a clear chronology of where it begins. But what we do know is that the religion was not limited to either the population or only the ruler. That the population was as dedicated, which is why you have all the local leaders or merchants donating to the temple and contributing to creating lingas.
Right.
And you have titles given to these kings, post death titles that reflect which sect they followed, be it Shaivism, Vaishnavism, or Buddhism for that matter. There are kings who with titles as Shivapada, which means they reached Shivapada after death. You also have kings with titles Paramasaugata Pada, which is a Buddhist title because Buddha is the Paramasaugata. At the
Okay.
same time, like I said, you also have this religion with its own ashramas, hermitages being present all over the kingdom, being prevalent among the people. All the references we find to Shaivism being predominant while there also being Vaishnavism and Buddhism is a reflection that these religions have percolated or were as prevalent among the masses as they were in royalty. And the rulers wouldn't be dedicating resources to building temples to only their personal belief unless it also gave them currency in the eyes of their people.
Correct. And it is not mutually exclusive. Like you said, a
Not
Vaishnava
be that
can
way.
donate to a Shaiva temple, a Shaiva can go to a Buddhist monastery and then
Yeah,
a Vaishnav, like which we in India intuitively we know we always have done, right? It's never,
absolutely.
yeah. So Hindu paramparas or sampradayas are not necessarily exclusive.
Exactly.
They are not denominations. You can go to,
Let me put it to you this way. Let me give the example of a Chola king, Parantaka the Great, Parantaka the First. Okay. Now, Parantaka, in a Shiva temple that he builds, the walls of the temple are full of inscriptions that are full of sculptures that show the story of the Ramayana. Now, if the king, being a Shaivite because he built the Shiva temple, if he saw Vaishnavism as essentially an outsider who was antagonistic to his own religious belief, he would not have done that. So, putting that in these kinds of silos is not only ridiculous but also mildly nefarious. You know, it is being done with the full knowledge and awareness. It is not being done out of ignorance. It is being done with the full knowledge and awareness, and there is a clear motive behind doing this. The classic policy of divide and rule.
correct. I think it is also a little. Firstly, there is this reversal of gazes. That is one, and secondly, I think it is interpolating realities of today into the past, and then creating like a justification that, oh, this is just like what it is today,
Exactly.
right? Which is quite problematic.
This here
Uh,
happened in this context that I am aware of, and therefore this here should have happened in that context about which I know nothing.
correct. And like I said, we are all history buffs, and neither of us is a trained historian. Neither the author himself is a trained historian. He clearly mentions he's a public historian and he's a passionate history buff. So I'm sure all of us care about the facts. So the idea here is that we present both sides with sources and then let people read, all the sources given, and then make up their mind. It shouldn't be that we spoon feed any opinions, and I think the reality will hopefully emerge based on, what is the right picture.
The
That's what
validity of
I
the
feel.
sources.
Sorry.
The validity of the sources.
Correct, the validity of the sources, and they all have to meld together and create a coherent story, right?
Hmm.
That is the whole thing. So anyways, with that, we come to the end of today's discussion, Jay. It's been a fascinating chat with you,
Thank you
and
so much.
I hope that the viewers will take a lot of value from this discussion, and we will be putting an exhaustive list of links in the show description. Jay, please do share that after the show.
Absolutely.
uh, and any images or anything if you have, we'll want to put that as well.
Mhm.
So we'd want all of you to go check out the sources and do further reading. So there's definite homework on this one, and that's it. With that, we come to the
Very
end of the show.
on a closing note, I would like to emphasize to the viewers of the show that it doesn't matter who is making the claim, what their supposed credentials or qualification is. Always actively seek out primary sources. Never take any claim at face value, irrespective of the face of the person making the claim. Always actively seek out primary sources. That is the only way you will be able to test the validity of the claim.
Correct. It all goes back to the primary sources. You
Yeah,
shouldn't get stuck in the citation loop.
yeah.
So yeah, that's it, guys. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you.